Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. And welcome to the sixth webinar of the Standing Committee for Gender Equality in Science. My name is Catherine Jamy, and I'm a researcher at the French CNRS, and I'm the chair of the Standing Committee for Gender Equality in Science, SCGES for short. So this committee is an independent committee formed 2 years ago by 9 international scientific unions, most of which are full members of the International Science Council. These founding partners had worked together on a project supported by ISC. The project was called A Global Approach to the Gender Gap in Mathematical, Computing, and Natural Sciences, how to measure it, how to reduce it. And the project became known as the Gender Gap in Science Project. Today, the SCGES has 20 partners, most of which are ISC International Union members. So together we represent millions of scientists brought together across disciplines to promote gender equality in science. The aim of SCGES is to ensure liaison amongst international scientific unions to foster gender equality and the implementation of the recommendations of the Gender Gap in Science project, especially in the scientific communities that the scientific unions represent. SCGES also has issued recommendations to safeguard gender equality in science in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. We also actively cooperate with policymakers and international organizations, first and foremost the International Science Council, for the promotion of gender equality in science. Today's webinar is organized by the International Union of History and Philosophy of Science and Technology, IUHPST, one of the founding partners of SCGES. Because I belong to this profession, I will chair the present webinar. And our topic today, we will address the issue of the visibility or invisibility of women in science. It is well known that the visibility of women is far from matching the numbers among scientists. This situation is the outcome of a long history. In the past, there were indeed women engaged in science, but like many historical actors, they are not part of the dominant narrative. It is not by looking, say, at the lists of Nobel Prize winners or at the lists of past members of academies of sciences in various countries that we can shed light on these women scientists of the past. Yet, it is important to know about them. Who were they? Where did they work? How did they manage to access scientific activity and sometimes careers in a world in which there was apparently no place for them at university? It is important that this question should find answers, if only to provide girls and young women with the possibility to identify themselves to scientists past and present, and to envision scientific careers for themselves. Our speakers today will discuss some of these women scientists of the past, and they will show what historical research strategies they have deployed in order to learn about them. They will also discuss the stakes of the visibility of women in science, past, present, and future, for science itself and for the societies in which we live. Now, before giving the floor to them, I would like to tell you more about who you are, who the audience of this webinar is. To begin with, as of 2 days ago, when we prepared the statistics, there were 292 persons registered to follow this webinar live. And as you can see, although more than a third of them is in Europe, all continents are represented, mostly Asia. There are even brave colleagues from Australasia who are getting up maybe extremely early in their morning to listen to us. Next, the gender breakdown in the audience. As you can see here, there are about 3/4 of members of the audience who identify as female, about 10% or a bit more who identify as male, but also 10% who prefer to not to answer the question of gender, and some of them also identify as non-binary. This is about the same statistics we have had for all our webinars so far, this being the 6th session. As to discipline, it is good to see that the audience is quite multidisciplinary, with mathematics and psychology being the two most represented, while history of science, as well as a number of social sciences, are also represented. Last but not least, we find that all career stages are represented among you, and this confirms our view that gender equality should and is of interest and of importance at all career stages. So let me now introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Patricia Farah of the University of Cambridge. Among her many publications relevant to our topic today, let me mention the book she published in 2017, A Lab of One's Own, Science and Suffrage in the First World War. It is my pleasure to give her the floor for her talk entitled Tomorrow Began Yesterday, Why History Matters.
Thank you, and I'm very, very pleased to be here. I will now try to share my screen, which I hope will work. So I hope you can all see this, and I will, I'll start by explaining my rather enigmatic title, Tomorrow Began Yesterday. I chose it to emphasize that the past can have a crucial effect on the future. And the most obvious example, of course, is global warming. But I think it's also true historically. And my favorite quotation on this topic is by Søren Kierkegaard, who's a Danish philosopher who was very influential on Niels Bohr when he was formulating quantum mechanics. And what Kierkegaard said was that life can only be understood backwards, but must be lived forwards. And that sort of encapsulates my own approach to history. So as a historian, I feel that I investigate the past in order to understand how we've reached the present. And for me, the whole point of doing that is to improve the future. And in this diagram, I've shown it as a looping process rather than a straight line, because the questions, the way that you want to change the future affects the questions that you ask about the past. So this sort of maxim is true for me personally, as well as more generally for history. So I got a degree in physics from Oxford. At the top, there's a physics laboratories, and at the bottom, you can see me in there somewhere, in a photograph composed entirely of women. And in my year at Oxford studying physics, there were 200 men, there were 8 women, which I naturally found quite difficult. But what I wasn't prepared for was the prejudice that I would experience after I left university. After I left university and I left physics, and men and women were very prejudiced against me as a physicist, so I learned to keep very quiet about it. And I sometimes felt that attitudes hadn't really changed since the early 19th century, where there's this pastiche, a lady of scientific habits, who's made up entirely of books and illustrates the terrible things that happen to you as a woman if you dedicate yourself to learning. I felt that the modern equivalent was Marie Curie. She was the only role model in physics that I was ever presented with, and she was always depicted as a scientific martyr, a woman who suffered for her science, and I kept hearing about how much she suffered, working in a leaky shed, not earning any money, and being perpetually cold and hungry. I'm sorry. When I saw photographs of her, she looked incredibly lonely and miserable and dowdy. And that certainly was not the future that I wanted for myself. Of course, I also learnt about her work in X-rays during the First World War, but that here she and her daughter are being presented is another sort of female stereotype. The Florence Nightingale nursing figure, dressed entirely in white, and that was also not a role that I foresaw for myself. So a few years ago, I decided to find out more about other women who were working at the same time as her and see if they'd had more enjoyable, more interesting lives. And I was delighted to find that indeed they had, and I would like to recommend some of these as role models. So today I'm going to talk about three in particular: a physicist, a mathematician, and an engineer. They all came from Cambridge, and these pictures show two of the women's laboratories in Cambridge during Marie Curie's lifetime. They didn't influence my own career, but what I hoped was that by writing about them, I could show younger women that choosing science can be a very positive decision. And also because by looking at the past, what I wanted to do was to expose prejudices that existed then and have been carried on into the present, and so help to confront and tackle them. So the first of my three women is Edith Stoney. She was from Dublin, and on the right you can see her with her sister Florence, who became a radiologist. She was a doctor, and her father George, a distinguished physicist who coined the word electron. So Edith Stoney studied physics at Cambridge, but although she got first-class marks, she only got a certificate, not a full degree, because extraordinarily, it was not until 1948 that women could get a degree at Cambridge. So she taught for a few years, and then she got a job teaching physics at the New London School of Medicine in 1912. Around then, that was the only place in London where women could study medicine, and she's the figure standing in the centre of the picture. When the
Patricia,
yes?
Can you speak closer to your microphone, please?
Yes, sorry, my voice was cracking up. It seems to have recovered. Is that better?
She
got a job teaching physics at the New London School of Medicine. So you can see her here in the middle of the picture. As soon as the war started, she wanted to work abroad as a radiologist, but she had a lot of problem with the War Office, who wouldn't employ her. Another woman who had a very similar problem was Elsie Inglis, who's the shorter woman on the left. She was Scottish, she was a surgeon, and as soon as the war started, she wrote to all the suffrage societies. She was a very influential suffrage leader, and she raised enough money to equip several teams of people to go out to the front in Europe, all equipped with bandages and drugs and ambulances and stretchers and all the things that you need for looking after men during wartime. So she offered her services to the British War Office, who told her to go home and keep still. The commanding officer just doesn't want to be troubled with hysterical women. So in contrast, some of Britain's allies accepted her suggestion very, very gladly, and she went off, and she and her teams went off to France and to Serbia. So Edith Stoney started off her career abroad at one of the Scottish women's hospitals in France, and then she went to Royaumont, where a Cistercian abbey had been converted into a hospital, and the woman in white with blonde hair standing in the middle was the head of this particular hospital. This is a painting by one of the nurses. Edith Stoney worked very hard there. When she was trying to get employment somewhere else, she wrote a letter explaining what it was that she'd done while she was there, how she'd had to work in sub-zero temperatures, and how she provided lighting for the surgeons. 50 candle power were lamps I'd stuck in cocoa tins for shelter. We dared show no light, of course, but had to run the engines, the car engines, for the x-rays. And this is the sort of equipment that she used, portable equipment for localizing bullets in the soldiers. And the Scottish hospitals funded x-ray cars that were very similar to the ones that Marie Curie was organizing in France, although they're much less well known. And then Stoney went to Serbia and Salonika. So like these women, she sailed out to join the women's Scottish hospitals. And I know about them because of this book, Doctor in War and Peace, written by a doctor, Isabel Hutton. And you can see on the left one of the collecting cans, Help the Scottish Women's Hospitals, Help Gallant Little Serbia. So there are hundreds and hundreds of women out there. It's a very gripping and grueling account. Hutton mentions Stoney several times. She says she could carry heavy She could carry heavy loads of equipment, repair electric wires sitting astride ridge tents in a howling gale, and work tirelessly on an almost starvation diet. And before she went off to Serbia, she bought a small dynamo while she was passing through Paris, and she used it to wire up generators to make her equipment work and light the hospitals. These women endured the most appalling conditions. It was very, very hot in the summer. It was freezing cold and snowy in the winter. They all suffered from dysentery, malaria, typhoid. The conditions were extremely unsanitary, and they had extremely little equipment. So somehow they converted an old and filthy silk factory into a working hospital. And Edith Stoney wrote that her dark room, where she processed the x-rays, was partly in the flue of the tall factory chimney, and the blizzard streamed through the outhouse where I was and up the chimney. When I creaked up the ladders in stocking feet to the loft where 54 of us now slept, there could be no thought of washing, with ice already in the jug. And here's a selection of the medals that she won after the war, most of them from Serbia and from France. And Edith Stoney and all the women who were out there with her are far better commemorated abroad than they are in Britain, where we heard virtually nothing of them during the 2014 to 18 commemorations. It's, of course, very difficult to find out information about these women's lives because very few records were kept, but some extraordinary pieces of information have survived. And this is my favourite. It's a scrap of letter from a doctor out in Serbia with Edith Stoney. And Ellie Rendell wrote, "Our candles are almost finished. We have to sit in darkness most of the time. The smells are horrible. Dead horses and dogs lie about. Heaps of dirty dressings are thrown all over the station. Bitterly cold and snowing." One of the things that really moved me about this was that I was sitting in the LSE Women's Library, which is very, very modern and well lit. And I went through a book of material, a folder of material, and I found a tiny envelope. And it had censored stamps all over it. And inside there was this little scrap of paper written in pencil. And that was this letter. And I just found it extraordinary that it should have survived all the way from Serbia to London and then find its way into a library where I could read it. So the woman that Ellie Rendell was writing to was on the committee of the Scottish Women's Hospital, and her name was Ray Strachey, and she's the second woman that I'm going to talk about. She was at Newnham, which you can, the red brick building you can see on the top right, and she studied mathematics. That's where she'd met Ellie Rendell. And she later became an extremely influential suffrage leader. She studied maths at Cambridge, she studied engineering at Oxford, and she wrote to her aunt. Her aunt was the president of Bryn Mawr. She wrote, "The more mathematics I learn, the more I wonder that anyone can call them dull or useless. They seem to me to be the most exciting and beautiful ideas, exquisitely expressed." She did get rather sidetracked while she was at Cambridge. She was the captain of the cricket team. In the picture on the left, she's the woman sitting in the middle holding the ball. She was also a major suffrage organiser. She wrote, "We've started a society which has now got more than 3/4 of the college and which is joined with Girton and amalgamated to the National Society. Cambridge has become a centre of activity, meetings, debates, plays, petitions, etc., all through the term." And these are just two examples of the beautiful silk banners that these suffrage women took with them on processions. So you can see on the right, there's one which pays tribute to radium and Marie Curie, because these women were very advanced scientifically. And on the left is my favourite. So you can see there's a female graduate, and she's locked behind a fence with people who were then called convicts and lunatics, who also were not eligible for the vote. And there's this little caption at the top right of that picture saying, "It's time I got out of this place. Where shall I find the key?" Which always seems to me a very modern sentiment. So when the war started, suffragists all stopped campaigning, and they started patriotically supporting the war. Ray Strachey was very influential in that move. She worked in an office in Victoria Street in London for the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, you can see on the right. And one of the things she did was set up a professional welding school for women, which is why I've shown the other picture. And she hired a large staff of interviews to place thousands of women a year into paid work as clerks, munitionettes, general labourers. And Strachey remained politically active for the rest of her life. She wrote to her mother, Pippa, that was her sister-in-law, and I have wound ourselves into the very thick of the intrigues. We found ourselves dictating the leading article of the Times one day, sitting up until 4 o'clock preparing draft schemes. I'm packed so tight with interviews that I can hardly breathe and find myself panting from one cabinet minister at dinner time, only to breakfast with another the next day. You could say that, like me, Ray Strachey leaked out of the pipeline because she did not stay in maths and engineering. And that leaky pipeline is a very common model, and it's one I dislike intensely because it implies that women have got no agency. It implies that they leave a field of physics or another science because they're no good at it. Whereas quite often, like Ray Strachey and like me, women leave science because they want positively to go and do something else and pursue a different career. Ray Strachey played an enormous role in securing equality for women in this country. This is just one of the many books that she wrote. But if the war hadn't happened, she would quite likely have continued on into a degree in engineering. This is what she wrote just before the war. She wrote to her mother, I've decided I must go to London next winter for my engineering. The various people I have seen all advise it. I saw Mrs. Ayrton, who is, as you know, a shining light in the world of electrical arc lamps, and she was most encouraging and gave me a letter to the head of the technical college. And the woman she's referring to, Hertha Ayrton, is my third example of Curie's contemporaries. You quite well may have never heard of her, but she was quite well known at the time and she was quite eminent. So this is a list of some of her achievements. She got a certificate in maths at Cambridge in 1881, but of course she couldn't graduate like the rest of them. She became the first female member of the Institution of Electrical Engineers. She was the first woman who read her own paper at the Royal Society, and she won the Hughes Medal for engineering. That's a very, very prestigious medal. She won the Hughes Medal at the Royal Society. She was also a prolific inventor, and she registered 26 patents, including this line divider, which is a precision instrument for architects and artists to scale up their drawings. And it received an accolade in Nature, very prestigious place, very handy instrument for architects, engineers, and practical drawing. And she thought about being a part-time inventor, but one of her patrons was another woman, Barbara Bodichon, who was a prominent feminist. And a lot of these women clubbed together to help each other because, of course, there was no way that someone like Hertha Ayrton could get a salaried job. But thanks to Bodichon, she went on and pursued a career in scientific research. And she was most famous for her work on electric arcs. That's her book on the bottom left, one of her diagrams. And this was a very important area of study because it was used to stop electric streetlights flickering and stuttering. And it was also extremely important for the new movie projectors that were being developed, which used to be called the flicks colloquially because they flickered. One problem was that as a woman, a married woman, she was expected to look after her husband. And when he became ill, her research became interrupted and they had to go to a health spa to convalesce. And this is it, it's Margate. Margate's a big resort in the east of the country on the Kent coast. And this is what it looked like about the time that she was there. But of course, she was no ordinary tourist. She'd never been to the sea before. And she was absolutely fascinated by the way that the waves convert the sand into ripples. And while she was there, she carried out a lot of research into the ripples like the ones you can see on the left and on the right. And on the left, there's a zinc bath, because what she did when she got back to their lodging house was ask the landlady for a zinc bath, and then she put it on the floor, and she got all sorts of ordinary equipment like pudding dishes and soap dishes, and she carried out all sorts of experiments, making waves in her zinc bath to work out how the sand ripples were forming. And she also went on to study it very mathematically, as you can see on the right. And she gave 3 papers at the Royal Society. One of them, as I said, the first one read there by a woman. And by then she rather professionalized her equipment, but that was how it started, was in a zinc bath on the floor of a boarding house. She also went on to make more inventions, and at the beginning of the war, she invented a thing called a flapper fan, which was to expel all the foul air from the trenches, and the War Office distributed several thousand to soldiers who were abroad. And then she won the Hughes Medal, although a lot of the men were pretty disgusted that it was given to a woman. And then she was nominated for a fellowship because she was so prestigious by this time. But her application for a fellowship was refused on what then presumably seemed the excellent grounds that she was married, and the Royal Society wouldn't accept married women. She became very friendly with Marie Skłodowska-Curie. I should apologise to both the French and the Poles for that pronunciation. I mean, it'd be called networking now. They were both female scientists, married to another scientist, and so they were quite unusual, but they had a lot in common. And they met in 1903 at London's Royal Institution, and that neither of them was allowed to give a talk, and Marie Curie had to sit in the audience with Hertha Ayrton, listening to her husband giving a talk about the research he'd been carrying out. So you can imagine why they bonded and became very close friends. So in 1911, Marie Curie had some sort of breakdown. You can see here on the right, she's in a journal called Les Hommes du Jour, Men of the Day, and she's got her husband's name underneath her, not her own name. And she was accused of having an affair with one of Pierre Curie's close colleagues, Langevin. He was married, she was not, because her own husband had died by that stage. She was a widow. And yet, although he didn't get criticised, she was absolutely lambasted in the press. And she was very distressed about it. And she came over to England suffering from what we would now call a nervous breakdown. And Hertha Ayrton looked after her. So this was in 1911. That was the year there was a big census in Britain, and a lot of suffrage women decided that they would not answer the census. They didn't want to be counted. They didn't think they were citizens because they didn't have the vote. And this is Hertha Ayrton's own census paper, which somehow has survived. And she's written on it, "How can I answer all these questions if I have not the intelligence to choose between 2 candidates for Parliament?" An ironic question. "I will not supply these particulars until I have my rights as a citizen. Votes for women, Hertha Ayrton." Ayrton was a very keen suffragist. Marie Curie was not, but Ayrton persuaded her to sign her one and only petition. And also Hertha Ayrton taught her daughter, Irene, she taught her mathematics. So in 1919, Ayrton told a Daily News journalist, I don't agree with sex being brought into science at all. The idea of woman and science is completely irrelevant. Either a woman is a good scientist or she is not. It seems to me that that's an absolutely wonderful objective, beautifully articulated, but even now, more than a century later, we still haven't achieved it. There's still very few women in the upper echelons of scientific career structures. So the employment prospects, the employment earnings of women and men in the sciences are very different, and I'm sure that everybody watching knows all about that. There isn't, in my opinion, one grand solution to this problem, and for myself, however many books I write, I'm never going to change the world, but I do feel that I and everybody else can make a contribution. So I've always been a believer in small incremental change. When I was a teenager, I read Middlemarch by George Eliot, one of Victorian England's most famous books. And this is the ending. But the effect of her being on those around her was incalculably diffusive. For the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts. And that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. So collectively, but not singly, women of the past and of the present can make a big difference for women of the future. And there's still lots of complaints, obviously, about discrimination against women. It can all seem very disheartening. On the other hand, I know that in the course of my own life, things have improved enormously. And so I rather agree with this sentiment by Ray Strachey. The establishment of equality of pay and opportunity for women may lie far ahead in the future, but that it does lie there is beyond question. The day of economic emancipation will come, just as the day of political emancipation, the vote, just as the day of political emancipation came. So I will end there on that positive note of hope, and thank you very much for listening, and I'm very much looking forward to the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for this really interesting talk where we can see already how one goes about finding about scientific women in the past. Our second speaker today is Bridget Stenhouse of the University of Toronto and the Open University in the UK. Her research focuses on 19th century mathematicians who did not work within the academic milieu, including but not exclusively women. She will now present some of her research on Mary Somerville, a 19th century mathematician. Bridget?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invite to talk. So today I'll be speaking on navigating gendered barriers to scientific knowledge through spousal cooperation, Mrs. and Mr. Mary Somerville. The kind of point of my talk, I hope, will be showing kind of the difficulties of writing about women in science, especially in the way that we tell histories can render them invisible, and also kind of the ways in which looking for maybe the first or the best or the kind of most prestigious can sometimes hide women away that we might otherwise learn about. I'm just going to do this, and then hopefully something at the top of my screen will disappear and stop blocking the slides. So I'm going to focus on Mary Somerville and her husband, just a little bit of biographical information. Mary Somerville was born Mary Fairfax in 1780, and she lived until 1872 even. So she lived a very, very long life. And she was born to a family of the minor Scottish gentry. So I just want to kind of point out the limitations of this talk in a way, in the sense of I'm still talking about an incredibly wealthy woman who was not aristocratic, but still of a very sort of high social class, which was important to her. And as we'll see during this talk, was sort of crucial for her access to scientific spaces and communities, even though she was sort of excluded from the more official professional institutions. And to give an idea of the kind of social class that she was in, she was distantly related to the Barons Fairfax. And in 1837, she also attended the coronation of Queen Victoria. So definitely definitely the social elite. She became known as a mathematician for solutions to mathematical problems that she submitted to a periodical called the Mathematical Repository. And she also very much built her reputation through involvement in what I'm going to call throughout this talk, polite society. And these two things I'll talk about in a bit more detail in a minute. Kind of the book that she's usually best remembered for today is her translation of Laplace's Mécanique Céleste. So this book was a treatment of physical astronomy, so kind of reducing the motions of the planets and moons to the application of mathematical formulae. After she published this translation, she then wrote multiple books surveying recent scientific developments. They've been described as reflective books. And so she wrote these on the connection of the physical sciences, one on physical geography, and one on microscopic and molecular science. For anyone who's more of a physical scientist than a mathematician, arguably On the Connection of the Physical Sciences is a book that she's more well remembered for than her mathematical translation. But both of them were very well received critically. And whereas the translation of Laplace unfortunately did not sell very well, On the Connection of the Physical Sciences very much did sell well. Somerville was very much a society lady. As we'll see, she got married, she had children. She also painted. So the portrait on the left is a self-portrait that she did sort of clearly in the middle of her life. She also played piano. She could read Latin and Greek. She spoke French, although she unfortunately did struggle with German, which I will come back to at the very end of the talk. So we know very, very little about Mary Somerville's mathematical studies or anything scientific before her first marriage. We do have her personal recollections, which is pretty much the main resource we have about her early life. There's not very many primary sources. In her personal recollections, which is an autobiography she wrote when she was around 86 years old, she talks about being interested in mathematics from a young age, but always being kind of discouraged by her parents from pursuing this study. And she ended up getting books through her brother's tutor and things like that. And so it was very slow and very sort of difficult to study mathematics for her as a child. She got married for the first time in 1804 to her second cousin, Samuel Gregg. And this is what she says about this marriage in her personal recollections. She says, my husband had taken me to his bachelor's house in London, which was exceedingly small and ill ventilated. I was alone the whole of the day, so I continued my mathematical and other pursuits, but under great disadvantages. For although my husband did not prevent me from studying, I met with no sympathy whatever from him, as he had a very low opinion of the capacity of my sex, and had neither knowledge of nor interest in science of any kind. I took lessons in French. It's interesting here that she specifically mentions taking lessons in French when she was going to make her name as an expert in French mathematics in Britain. And this was very crucial at the start of the 19th century because there was a widespread feeling that British mathematics was in decline. And the way to rejuvenate this mathematics was to translate or bring over French mathematics. And that's kind of how she made her name. But again, even during this marriage, we know very little about her life other than what she says in her personal recollections. Although interestingly, Hattie Lloyd in her PhD thesis about the Royal Institution notes that Mary Gregg, as she then was a member of the Royal Institution while she was in London at this time. Although unfortunately, other than the fact that she was a member, we don't know kind of which lectures she went to, what other resources of the Royal Institution she made use of. Unfortunately, in 1807, Samuel Gregg died. And so Mary Somerville returned, or Mary Gregg, as she then was, returned to Edinburgh, where she'd grown up with her young son. And with kind of the freedom of widowhood, she was able to start studying mathematics. And this is when we start to see her fingerprint in the archival record a bit more clearly. So this is when she starts submitting her solutions to puzzles published in the Mathematical Repository. And the image at the bottom of the slide is actually a photograph of a medal that she was awarded for one of these solutions. Interestingly, the solutions were printed under the pseudonym A Lady, but it's very clear that people did know who she was because this medal very much bears her name. At the top on the right-hand side, it says Maria Gregg. And so even though they were printed sort of anonymously, Somerville is still making her name as an accomplished mathematician. At around this time in Edinburgh, she started making more social connections. She talks about being out in society quite frequently. She met the professor of natural sciences of Edinburgh University, John Playfair, who'd previously been professor of mathematics and was very vocal about the decline of British mathematics in some of his reviews. And she also met the editors of the Edinburgh Review, a very influential periodical, with whom she shared similar political ideals. And so we start seeing her a little more visibly. In 1812, she remarried. Her marriage to her second cousin hadn't gone particularly well, so she decided to marry her first cousin, and this was way more successful. Her first cousin was Dr. William Somerville. He's given the title doctor. He was a medical doctor, a physician for the army. And so he'd spent time as an army physician in the south of Africa, as well as in Canada, and I believe in Malta. He was someone who had a gentlemanly interest in scientific knowledge, but not someone who kind of pursued this reputation of being an expert in anything. He didn't really write any papers, although some observations that he made of indigenous peoples and plant life in Africa were sort of published about 20 years after he first made them. He wasn't really someone frequently publishing papers or claiming kind of expert status. He was much more the kind of gentleman who saw the Royal Society and other sort of learned societies as a place for to be out in society, meeting like-minded men, having a good time. Very early on in their marriage, William Somerville was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He was actually nominated by John Playfair, who, as I mentioned, was a friend of Mary Somerville's. And then in 1816, he got a new job. And so together the Somervilles moved to London. So Somerville's returning to London at this point. In order to get a good introduction to the scientific community in London, they went armed with a letter of introduction by Leonard Horner, who it seems likely that William Somerville met in the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And I'll just read the letter here. So Horner wrote, "You've probably heard of Dr. He's writing this letter to Alexander Marset, husband of Jane Marset. So he wrote, "You've probably heard of Dr. Somerville's appointment to the Army Medical Board. He is a very good fellow and his wife a very interesting woman. She is a person of very extraordinary acquirements, particularly in mathematics, but she has not a shade of blue in her stockings. She is desirous of being acquainted with Mrs. Marset. She will send her card with a note from my sister to Mrs. Marset when she reaches London." And Mrs. Marset, or Jane Marset, very quickly introduced the Somervilles to the bustling scientific community of London, and they immediately made lots of connections. I highly recommend Somerville's Personal Recollections as a book to literally everyone. The descriptions of kind of what it meant to be a scientist in London in the 1830s and all of the sort of meeting at people's houses, doing little experiments in gardens and back rooms is just great. There's also a wonderful description of climbing Mount Vesuvius while it is erupting, which is great. Anyway, so she kind of very quickly gets embedded into this very fruitful space. And I just want to make clear here that even though Somerville doesn't really have anything that we might point to as a publication, certainly nothing that's explicitly printed with her name on it, she's still able to build this reputation as an expert mathematician by being out in society, by having these conversations with people. She must have been discussing her mathematical studies quite openly for people to describe her as someone with very extraordinary acquirements, particularly in mathematics. Regarding Somerville's own sort of nominations to scientific societies, she did have quite a few honorary memberships. I've just listed the ones that I know about here. So H means that she had an honorary membership, C means that she was a corresponding member, and F she was listed as a foreign member. And so actually we see that she was 90 years old, or 89, before she was elected as a full member, and that was of the Società Geografica Italiana. And all of the other sort of elections or memberships that she had this caveat of being like a foreign membership or an honorary membership. And what's interesting is that if you look at this, you might think that the story of her engagement with learned societies is one of exclusion, when in fact, the people that made up these societies very much treated her like an equal. She was very much part of a very fruitful and important exchange of information that happened in drawing rooms, in letters, and in these social spaces outside of the learned societies. And also with the assistance of her husband, which I'll go into in a bit more detail, she was also able to make good use of the resources of these societies, their libraries, their specimen collections, and also the sort of availability of people in them, long before she ever had her own honorary memberships. And something interesting to note is that she doesn't seem to have made use of these honorary memberships much at all. For example, she didn't append the letters FRS or FRAS after her name after her elections. She never seems to have made claim to enter the buildings of the societies themselves. In 1844, when she was in London, there's a very sort of salty letter from mathematician Augustus de Morgan, which says, "Oh, I heard you came to the Royal Astronomical Society and you claimed you didn't know you were a member, but you definitely did. I wrote you a letter and you replied to it." So for some reason, she was either pretending she didn't know she had this honorary membership, or she didn't feel like this granted her her own access or access in her own right to the space of the Royal Astronomical Society. And also, to be honest, they were kind of superfluous to her because, as I have mentioned, and as we'll see, the mediation of her husband was like she already had as much access as she needed. It is just in this sort of unofficial way. So regarding the physical space of the societies, William acted as Somerville's representative. As we heard, Hertha Ayrton was the first woman to read her own paper at the Royal Society, but I guess nearly 100 years earlier, Somerville had a paper read at the society by her husband, William Somerville. What's interesting here is that when the paper was printed in the Philosophical Transactions, both of their names are on it. So it wasn't just given under William's name, which I can only assume has happened, but it was by Mrs. Mary Somerville and only communicated by William Somerville. So even though the only access she got to the Royal Society was as a marble bust, she was never even elected an honorary member to that one. William Somerville, who was a fellow of the Royal Society, could read her paper and get it printed. I also love this letter from William Brodripp, who was, I believe, a conchologist and a botanist. And so he writes to Mary Somerville, he says, "My dear madam, Dr. Somerville told me yesterday that you are anxious to procure information concerning the plants and animals of the Himalaya mountains, and requested that I would communicate to you anything which I might know on the subject. The doctor has, no doubt, stated to you the few hints I was able to give him as we sat in council." And so what it sounds like here, and unfortunately, I don't know which council meeting it is, both William Brodripp and William Somerville were members of the Geological and the Linnaean Society, so it's very likely one of the meetings of those. But it sounds like Mary Somerville knew that she wanted to ask William Brodripp this question about plants and animals of the Himalaya mountains, and maybe the most expedient or the easiest way to do that was to send her husband with a little to-do list and say, okay, at this council meeting tomorrow, where you'll see Brodripp, ask him these questions and get this information from him. And so then Brodripp not only responded directly to William Somerville, he also then wrote a follow-up letter in which he recommended a book on birds by Gould for Somerville to read, and also suggested that she could see a specimen of a Himalayan rhododendron in a nursery of someone called Mr. Knight. So even though she herself could not enter this space, she still had easy access to the people in it through the mediation of her husband. And also the people who sort of were fellows, the men who were fellows of these royal society, of these learned societies, did not cease to exist when they left the buildings of the societies. And so, as I've sort of previously alluded to, Somerville had direct access to these people through polite society. And when she married William Somerville, she gained a chaperone. So she gained a constant companion and eager chaperone, which greatly increased both her social and her geographic mobility. When submitting solutions to the Mathematical Repository, that periodical, she'd done so through writing letters to a man called William Wallace. In July 1812, soon after Sir Mary and William married, they actually travelled down to the south of England together, and at this time, Somerville was able to meet William Wallace for the first time. And it's interesting to see the transition in their letters at this time. The letter that we have from before they met is incredibly formal. Somerville writes in third person, and sort of it's very deferential. Whereas after they met, the letters are much more sort of informal. They share information, or the letters that we have are from Wallace to Somerville, and he shares information about the illness of his daughters, his hopes that they'll get better, his worries that they won't, alongside kind of mentoring her in her studies of mathematics, suggesting books to read, as well as giving critical feedback on her drafts of solutions. And so by marrying William and having this ability to travel more widely, Somerville was able to really cement this connection with Wallace and develop a much more generative sort of mathematical mentorship relationship with him. While they were visiting Wallace, he also introduced them to William Herschel. Apologies, everyone is called William. I'm really sorry. Hopefully I can keep them all separate. And so again, we have a letter from William Herschel to William Wallace where he's talking about the possibility of meeting Somerville, and he says, "I shall be very happy to see the lady and any of the party you mention at Slough. And you may be assured that the trait and the character of a lady to be a good mathematician without wrangleship will be highly esteemed." So again, we see in 1812, 20 years before any of these honorary memberships, Somerville's very much being talked about as a mathematician, and this thing about a mathematician without wrangleship, when people studied at Cambridge and took the tripos, the final exam, students would be ranked, and the top students would be named senior wrangler or wranglers. And so what Herschel is saying is he respects Somerville's acquirements, even though she hasn't studied at university. The image on the right is a diary entry from Somerville when she traveled to Paris in 1817. She traveled with some of her children, I believe her brother, and also, of course, William Somerville. And when she was in Paris, she actually managed to meet Laplace, who, as I mentioned, she would later translate his book, Mécanique Céleste, into English. And it was this book which kind of cemented her place in the historical narrative. So this diary entry is lovely. It's actually reproduced in Patterson 1985, and there's a bibliography at the end where she talks about meeting all these people. She met Arago, Poisson, Berthollet, and of course, she dined with Laplace, and she was able to discuss with him possible improvements to the mathematics that was inside the Mécanique Céleste. So she was able to have this intellectual exchange, but also by meeting Laplace, she was able to further cultivate her reputation because she clearly impressed him. A few years later, he wrote her a letter where he said there were very few judges of his work as enlightened as she was. And indeed, a sort of an anecdote started to circulate that apparently Laplace said only 3 people could understand his work, and they were Miss Fairfax, Mrs. Greig, and Mrs. Somerville. Obviously, all 3 of those were the same person. They were Somerville's maiden name, first married name, and the name that she's known by. And this anecdote even turns up in the diary of Queen Victoria. So it really circulated quite far and shows just how sort of well respected she was. Interestingly, sometimes the anecdote is given as the only woman, sometimes it's the only person. And so there is a bit of variety, but I like to stick with the only person version. And so moving on, through the mediation of William, Somerville was also able to access texts that she might not otherwise have been able to. When traveling to meet William Wallace, directly after their marriage, Wallace also gifted Somerville some books directly, which obviously wouldn't have been able to happen if she hadn't been able to travel to meet him. And in Somerville's personal recollections, which was edited by her daughter, Martha Charters Somerville, Martha wrote a small editorial note in which she says, William Somerville, so her father, was far happier in helping my mother in various ways, searching the libraries for the books she required, indefatigably copying and recopying her manuscripts to save her time. It was a labor of love. And if you look at the lending records, actually, of the Royal Society of London, you do see William Somerville's name crop up, taking out books, especially French scientific texts by people like Biot, usually around the time when Somerville was writing a new edition of Connection of the Physical Sciences. So it seems like she specifically was requesting these books in order to help her while she was updating her books for new editions. And so kind of, although she herself couldn't access this library, she had someone who could. Interestingly, even after she had honorary membership of the Royal Astronomical Society, when she needed books from that library and her husband had a cold, she still sent Gerhard Moll, a Dutch astronomer, into the society to consult the books on her behalf rather than going herself. And so this kind of mediation seems to have been a preferred method for Somerville, rather than trying to claim space in these physical buildings herself. This letter from Frances Bailey shows the role William took in making sure that books and other texts could get to Mary Somerville. So Frances Bailey writes, I cannot close this letter without informing you that the Council of the Royal Astronomical Society have ordered a copy of the Greenwich observations to be, from time to time as they appear, given to Mrs. Somerville. 8 parts have now been printed since His Majesty granted us this privilege, and they are all tied up, ready to be delivered to your order. Shall I direct them to be left at the Athenaeum, as you may probably find means more readily of getting them from that place? So the Athenaeum was a gentleman's club, which William Somerville was actually one of the co-founding members in the 1820s, and this club was specifically aimed at men with literary and scientific interests. At this time, the Somervilles were living at the Royal Hospital in Chelsea, which was sort of outside of the maybe city centre is an anachronism, but was sort of a little bit away from the city. And so here it was seen to be easier to deliver these Greenwich observations to the Athenaeum Club for William Somerville to pick up at his leisure when he's in town and going back, rather than trying to post them or sort of relying on making sure that William and Mary Somerville would be at home at the right time, etc., etc. So just an idea of the importance of having this physical space, of having these club memberships for this kind of ease of circulation, because books and papers really did move so much, and Somerville's letters, which are all held at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, really demonstrate this beautifully, just how much these texts were moving around. It wasn't just William Somerville who assisted his wife. Mary Somerville also got assistance from people like mathematician Augustus de Morgan, who it seems took books out from the University of London and sort of lent them to her. So again, even though she couldn't access this space herself, she was still very much able to get the works that she needed. And kind of more interestingly, it wasn't just this sort of passive consumption of scientific knowledge. She took this and she made a very successful career as a scientific author. So beyond the mathematical puzzles that I mentioned, and then her translation of Laplace, she also had experimental results published in the Philosophical Transactions, and then later extracts of a few of her letters were published in Paris, London, and in Belgium. So the image on the left is an extract from one of her letters translated into French and then published by Quetelet in his journal Correspondance Mathématique. The publishing, William Somerville took on a very active role to ensure that Somerville's publications could be brought out. So he corresponded with her publisher, he proofread, he arranged for people to proofread the manuscript sheets, he circulated manuscript sheets to people who requested them before publication, and he also organized reviews. I'm gonna skip slightly. The unusualness of the arrangement between Mary and William Somerville was recognized even during their lifetime. Charles Lyell wrote this message to this letter to Mary Horner in August 1831. He said, "Had our friend Mrs. Somerville been married to Laplace or some mathematician, we should never have heard of her work. She would have merged it in her husband's and passed it off as his. A man may desire fame, reputation, and even glory for the sake of sharing it with one he loves. A woman cannot share it with her husband. It will be the utmost she can do not to make him of less importance by it." This is somewhat ironic considering that Mary Horner herself was a geologist, but a lot of her work has sort of been, it's very hard to witness her work, and so some of it may have been subsumed into work we think done by Lyell. And just to conclude, one of the ways that Mary Somerville is often remembered is sometimes as the first scientist. As I've sort of shown, the way that Somerville engaged with the scientific community is very different. This was at a time when professionalization had not quite happened. And so the things that we might look for, an academic appointment or membership of a society, or even sort of a keystone publication with a very tangible mathematical or scientific result just isn't there. And so people often grasp for another way to include her in histories. And one of these ways is sometimes to call her the first scientist, usually because the sort of rationale goes, the word was used, and it's one of the first printed instances of the word scientist was in a review of one of Somerville's books. It's often argued that because at the time people were known as men of science, they needed a new word to describe Mary Somerville, and so they called her a scientist. But I just want to make clear that she very much was not the only woman in her milieu. She corresponded with women like Anna Ella Smith, Ada Lovelace, as well as we saw her introduction to scientific society in London was through Jane Marcet. And so we need to be careful when we're talking about women while lifting one up, not to make others invisible. And so with that, I will conclude. Thank you very much for listening. If you would like a copy of these slides, or please do reach out, and also look out for a forthcoming special issue of Endeavour on marriage and mathematics. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bridget, for this very rich and interesting talk. So we will now move to our third and last speaker, Indiana Silva of the State University of Feira de Santana in the state of Bahia in Brazil. She works on the history of quantum mechanics as well as on the teaching of quantum mechanics in physics classrooms. I will now give the floor to her for her talk, which is entitled Visibility of Women in Science for an Anti-Oppressive World.
Thank you. So thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here and share with you all a piece of our work here in Brazil that I'm doing with my dearest and colleague and friend, Cláudia Sepúlveda. So today, I'm gonna start with some questions. How can our past make a difference for future generations? How can our work not only give us life, the life we deserve, but also fight for democratic societies? How can the visibility of women contribute to deconstructing oppression? Today, I will talk about how the history of women in science can promote an anti-oppressive education. For this, I will present some social phenomena we learned from our dearest feminist historians and philosophers of science, and then I'll invite us to think about it, what happens when these concepts meet Freudian pedagogy. Finally, I will present the Silva Sepúlveda approach. As we know, feminist critics of science have revolutionized our understanding of how gender plays a role in science, practice, and values. They taught us how science can be a place for oppression and how its practitioners use it to keep women in a subordinated place, or sometimes without a place at all. So they challenge science to be a better and more diverse ethos of inquiry. Fortunately, these criticisms also boosted the history of science. Feminist scholars look at this field and ask, were there women scientists? Why did some lives deserve a place in the history of science while others did not? What did it mean to have existed but not in the historical accounts? These scholars reported the invisibility of women in science. The history of women in science since the 17th has had a long life with diverse approaches, methods, and protagonists. It's not my intention here to give you the history of women in science, but rather to highlight some key points that are very important to the Silva Sepúlveda approach. For example, Rosira's breakthrough contributions that are essential to understanding gender segregation and women's struggle to become and remain scientists. While analyzing women scientists in America, Rosira theorized two social phenomena related to their professional careers: hierarchical segregation and territorial segregation. The first refers to women who had, for example, a lower salary than their male colleagues, doing the same work and struggle much more to lift their careers, such as becoming Turner University professors. The second relies on how women circulated freely and were welcome to do sex-type work or act in fields considered less prestigious for their male colleagues, for example, collating astronomical data or organizing natural history collections. In another very nice work, Rosira also identified the Matilda effect that occurred when women had their discoveries appropriated by their male colleagues and when they were not acknowledged by the scientific community. In addition to these structural walls that have imprisoned women scientists, there are also injustice barriers at the epistemic levels. Epistemic injustice, as Ricker would say, is the distributive unfairness in respect of epistemic goods, such as information and education, and how social agents get or do not get their fair share. These forms of injustice appear as testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice. On one hand, the testimonial injustice occurs when someone is judged as her capacity as a knower because of her social identity. In this case, social agents can use their identity power to create or maintain their social power as being the capacity to control others' actions. On the other hand, hermeneutical injustice is the doubt of our own capacity as a known. My interpretation is just like that. Testimonial injustice is about how the others see us, while hermeneutical injustice is about how we can see ourselves or do not can see at all. For example, it's about I see, but I'm not really listening to her, or I see, I'm not really hearing her. Or on the other hand, hermeneutical injustice is about I'm feeling, but I don't have the right words to describe it because I don't have hermeneutical resources to acknowledge my own experiences. For example, phrases like, I'm not good enough, I can do it, could be this kind of injustice. So to have hermeneutical resources, I ask yourself, who am I? How can I read my life as a woman, as a Black woman, as a white high-class woman, as a physics student, as a professor, as an educator? How can I open our eyes and see the injustice that intersect our lives in society? How can we fight for ourselves and others if we don't have hermeneutical resources? How can we promote epistemic confidence in women, for this matter, to promote gaining epistemic virtues, such as intellectual courage? We must think about our role as historians of women in science and our contributions to changing society. Emancipating marginalized groups is only possible, in my view, through a transgressive education using bell hooks words. Fricker works on epistemic injustice using example from literature. It's a very nice book, and I invite you to read it. It's very, very interesting. But here, I'll give you example from the history of women in science. This is the first one, concerning the testimonial injustice. In 1962, Jane Watson, Frank Crick, and Maurice Wilkins received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for their discoveries concerning the molecular structure of DNA. In his autobiography, The Double Helix, Watson wrote about Rosalind Franklin's role in the DNA discovery, quote, "Unfortunately, Maurice could not see any decent way to give Rosie the boot. To start with, she had been given to think that she had a position for several years. So I would say quite a modern example of gaslighting. Also, there was no denying she had a good brain. If she could only keep her emotions under control, there would be a good chance that she could really help him." Later, he added, she had done some more detailed measurements of water contents of her DNA samples. But even here, Maurice had doubts about whether she was really measuring what she claimed. So in this case, a credibility deficit emerges as a form of injustice because of Rosalind's social identity. They doubted her capacity as a knower, even when she was the only one with expertise in doing the experiment. So they didn't listen to her. They didn't share epistemic good with her. However, as we all know, Rosalind paved the way for modern molecular biology and genomics research by using an X-ray crystallography technique to produce the first photo of the DNA called photo 51, which was essential to Watson and Crick's double helix model. Here is a case to illustrate the hermeneutical injustice. Now we're going to use an interview with Melba Phillips, who was an American physicist and science educator. At the first moment, she doubted her capacity as a nun when she said, quote, "It's very hard to say, yes, I'm really better than. Sometimes it's really impossible to say, I'm better than the person who got this job because we are doubtful about all the factors involved." Then she ended by saying, "I've never felt intellectual discrimination. I felt some economic discrimination." And during this interview, she kept saying things very interesting. And then later, she said, quote, "I'm glad to have the opportunity to say it, that there were more American women studying physics when I was a student than there are today. I will add that as far as I'm concerned, as a student, I've never felt any discrimination at all." And then she highlighted, quote, "Women were not supposed to undertake a long period of apprenticeship. That was not the thing to do for a while. It took a great deal of determination to become a professional as a woman during some period in there, I think probably 50s. There was a discouraging social climate." So these ambivalent feelings during Philip's interview can be seen as her way of making sense of her own experience. She was trying to engage her hermeneutical resources to reconstruct her memories, but it's very hard to imagine that she didn't suffer any gender discrimination. In this case, we believe that we can promote self-understanding from the visibility of women in science and then be conscious of injustice that may cross our lives. And so I do believe in Frickers when she says, "One hermeneutical rebellion inspires another." So how could we use these key concepts together to promote an anti-oppressive world? Our bet is through education. We argue that when history of women and epistemic injustice meet Freudian pedagogy, we can promote a better understanding of science, but not only that. Here, I will use now Freudian pedagogy to think about an anti-oppressive education that works against forms of oppression. So a critical pedagogy, as Freud said, aims to perceive social, political, and economical contradictions and to take action against the oppressive elements of reality. So through critical knowledge and thinking, students can be conscious of oppressions and then act and change towards resisting and challenging oppression. As Kumashiro calls our attention, students can, quote, develop the knowledge and thinking skills, not only the process of altering and normalizing, but also their complicity in this process. In a critical pedagogy, as a libertarian education aims to prepare individuals for democracy, students are now subjects of their own history, involving political and cultural struggle in search of their emancipation and have a critical awareness of the world. On the other hand, educators will teach about oppression, about scientific concepts, but not only that. Through geological actions, which are the heart of education as a practice of freedom to change society as a result. Educators will fight against what Freud called the banking education that serves, quote, the interests of oppressors who care neither to have the world revealed nor to see it transformed. So we believe that when the history of women works with epistemic injustice, it could lead students to their limit situations, which is a way of revealing individuals their true nature as a concrete historical dimensions of a given reality. As Freire said, a climate of hope and confidence develops, which leads us to attempt to overcome the limit situations. Using now Fricker's social epistemology, which is very nice to talk with Freire in this sense, the limited situations would be a way of sharing experience to be conscious of our own. When we see women, as we saw now with these wonderful talks, when we see women placed in time, in space, as well as their contributions to science using gender studies and epistemic injustice, we not only think of ourselves, but giving students the opportunity to identify the oppressions they might fight against to change society or even to survive. Now, I'm going to present to you how we can use these theories together to promote an anti-oppressive education, considering our role in society as historians of science and educators. So the Silva Sepúlveda approach uses the history of women in science to give students a critical view of science, but also a view of the dynamics of oppression. For this, our work is part of the nature of science research. The NOS teaches what science is, how scientific knowledge is developed, and how science interacts with society, culture, and human complexity. Now, researchers are investigating ways to promote the nature of science for social justice. And here, social justice code refers to an egalitarian society that is based on principle of equality and solidarity, that understand and values human rights, and that recognizes the dignity of every human being, according to Jaida et al. 2007. So our idea our approach is to refresh the NOS traditional questions by considering now gender studies and epistemic injustice. We consider now the process of oppressions, the maintenance, rupture of exploitation, violence against human groups, a structural identity prejudice, and credibility deficit. It's about to show how scientists can or used their power to marginalize groups based on gender, race, sexuality, and class, and so on. Now, we are not only teaching about science, but also how practitioners used science to control others' actions. This slide illustrates the Silva Sepúlveda approach. Using thus the history of women in science, we could work with NOS elements through three dimensions: epistemological, socio-political, and Freirean pedagogy. In the first dimension, we can teach about sciences, epistemic injustice, feminist critiques of science. In the socio-political dimension, here is dedicated to discussing hierarchical and territorial segregation, intersectionality, and the Matilda effect. In the last dimension here, we have the Freirean pedagogy to teach the dynamics of oppression through geological actions. With Silva Sepúlveda approach, we would not only promote a critical view of science, but also an anti-oppressive education. So how could we use the Silva Sepúlveda approach in our classrooms? First, we can define our historical case by choosing our women and her contributions to science, and then looking at power relations and how gender, race, class are all together crossing her life during a period of time. Second, we identify the NOS elements that appeared from our historical case and consider, most importantly, to be an anti-oppressive education, socio-political questions. So I'm getting to the end of my talk now, and I'll leave you with bell hooks. Quote, "The classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy, and I would add, as our history of women in science. Visibility of women for social justice." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Indianara, for this very stimulating talk. I would now like to ask all our three speakers to turn their cameras on again, because we now have about half an hour for discussion and questions from our audience. I have some questions that I would like to address each of you and all of you, but let me start by putting to you questions from our audience. And there are, I think, two questions for Bridget. One is about, can you, outline what one might call Somerville's professional life? Because you have presented her, with, I would say, how her husband mediated for her in her relationship with sort of so-called professional academics. But can you say a bit more about her own contribution? And the second one is how exceptional or typical the Somerville couple was, and especially, can you say a few words about the Marcet couple? Was it, in your view, also that kind of couple?
Yeah, I don't know enough about the Marcets to compare directly. I know there's a really good chapter about them in Opitz and Van Tiggelen, and I think Lukenus's book on collaborative couples, which I need to go back to. And that chapter talks about kind of the fact that Alexander Marcet did also sort of there was some element of collaboration going into Jane Marcet's book. So Jane Marcet is very well known as an author of a book called Conversations on Chemistry. And so kind of, yeah, there was this similar collaboration. I don't know how much of that from Alexander was this like practical kind of extraction of knowledge through books, because I think there might be something different between the mathematical work that Somerville did and the chemical work that Jane Marcet did, just in the way that those sciences are practiced. Where that research was taking place might have been in different spaces. All of this to say, fascinating question. I'll look into that. That's a really good point. I do think, though, that still the Marcets and the Somervilles in the wider canon of sort of collaborative couples, as they're called, are still relatively unusual in the sense that a lot of that scholarship is about reclaiming women who were sort of whose work fell victim to the Matilda effect, which is where their work gets attributed to a male colleague, whether that's their spouse or another family member or sort of a professional colleague. Whereas with Somerville and Marcet, they managed to make their own name. And then we see their husband sort of filling this assistant role, which I really like. Regarding Somerville's professional life, I kind of want to say that it's impossible to disentangle those. Like, her role in the scientific community in London at that time was sort of someone who moved knowledge around, and she did that through her letters, and she did that. So it wasn't just her getting books from other people. She would also sort of pass things on to others. There's a really nice letter from John Herschel where he says, like, "I'm coming back from South Africa. I'm going via Rio de Janeiro. Anyone have anything scientific for me to do? Like, I'll do it while I'm there." And also sort of John William Lubbock asked Somerville's feedback for sort of his moon calculations, which is incredibly cryptic. I still am not sure what that was. But because this was before kind of professionalization of science really happened, and also because Somerville existed outside of those spaces anyway, these letters, this sort of circulation of knowledge was her contribution. What, like, she was someone who formed these communities and who moved knowledge around, and that was her importance. So yeah, thank you. Katrine, you're on mute.
Thank you. Apologies. Thank you, Bridget, for this reply. Let me see. I think I would like now to address my own question to Indianara, because you are really advocating the importance of teaching the history of science to scientists. So would you argue in general for the inclusion of history of science in all scientific curricula? But once we have said this, we are faced with what we are discussing now, which is what narrative do you adopt, and what. So it's both a need for scientific disciplines to take the history into account, and for the history of science to address the issue of the visibility of women in science. In a sense, would you say that, or could you say more on this matter?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for these wonderful questions. Yeah, I think it's important for the two different things. First, for scientists' informations in training, it's important to have a really critical view of history and philosophy to be a better, responsible social and environmental research or scientist. So I think for every young research in training, it's important to have history and philosophy of science in their curriculum. And in this case, there is a potential to use the history of women in science, because we can see all these injustices together and to emancipate women and to locate men to see their place in the injustice that cross all society. So now they have conscience, their place, where they are playing, into which place, which one is playing right now. On the other hand, for teaching, it's very important to think about it, that teaching is very important, not only to have more scientists, men and women out there, but also to have a better society. So our approach is to see both. Yes, we are going to train better scientists with history of women in science, with all complexities, with all kinds of narratives that we need. That's why it's important to have diverse protagonists, so we can have a really fruitful way to think all injustice based on race, gender, sexuality, and so on. On the other hand, we can think about society through education, and for us, it's very important to do during our present, to have a better future for next generation through our past. So I think you are right. We are doing the both, and we try with this to have a better world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question is for Patricia. I will read it out, although it's actually from Bridget. So what is the place of finding or recovering role models in the history of science? And second question, how does or should this inform our research?
Well, I personally think rescuing role models is extremely important, partly because I'm involved with applications for science in my university, and time after time, if you ask someone why they read physics or why they read history, they'll say, oh, there was a teacher at school that really inspired me. So I think role models in the past are very important, which is why I started by talking about my own disillusionment with Marie Curie. And I tried to present some more interesting role models. I also think everybody, part of the way history of science is told is people like narrating a good, interesting, dramatic And I think too often the women that we rescue from the past are set up as stereotypes. I mentioned the stereotype of Marie Curie as the nurse, as the carer, as the Florence Nightingale. But one of my great heroines that I would like to see elevated to a role model is Dorothy Hodgkin, who's still the only woman to win, the only British woman to win a Nobel Prize for Science. And she's actually not very well known in this country at all, in spite of that. And I think part of the reason is because she was just an ordinary woman who got on with it. She had 4 children, she had a husband, she had terrible arthritis in her hands, but she had an incredibly successful career, but she didn't make a big fuss about it, and there was nothing dramatic that happened. So in a way, that's rather a sort of disappointing sort of story to tell, and I think that's why she's not better known. And the other example that I would like to give is related to Indianara's talk. I mean, she mentioned Rosalind Franklin, who is routinely presented as a victim of the male rapacity of Crick and Watson and Maurice Wilkinson. But I think there's another way, again, less interesting way of talking about her, which converts her into a much more effective role model. She was a great pioneer in virology, and of course that's incredibly important given the last few years that we lived through. And if you look on her gravestone, which is in the Willesden Jewish Cemetery, it commemorates her as the founder of virological science. She was the first person, not just the first woman, she was the first person to analyze the structure of the tobacco mosaic virus, which is sort of, it's a bit like fruit flies. It's the founding virus of virology. She did that after she left King's College, after she'd finished working on DNA. And she always said it was much more interesting and much more difficult than working on DNA. And she went on to investigate several other projects, like she was working on the structure of the polio virus, which of course at that time was afflicting huge numbers of children. And she died very, very young, as is well known, but she died while she was still working on viruses. And the man that she'd employed, who was on her research team, who admired her enormously, Aaron Klug, went on to get the Nobel Prize. So it seems fairly obvious to me that she would have gone on to get the Nobel Prize as well. And it seems to me that that's a much more positive story to tell about a woman. I mean, okay, she died, but she was a huge success time. She was in a very, very important field, especially given the last few years. And I think that's much better than presenting her as a helpless victim, which is what happens so often. Sorry, that's rather a long answer. That's okay.
No, but I don't think there was a short answer, and I think your answer is very clear and to the point, actually. Yes, I also have been wondering when listening to, about this issue of role models, because when I was first involved in the Gender Gap in Science project, what we did was we did a survey of scientists around the world. We had 32,000 answers from different parts of the world and different disciplines. And from these answers, we had actually statistical evidence that, to summarize brutally, women's experience in science throughout their careers, across disciplines, across places in the world, is consistently less positive than that of men. So we do not want to optimize women in science. And as you said, some of them have great accomplishment, those whose names are known. But on the other hand, the victim image does seem to reflect some thing that has statistical evidence for it. Mm-hmm. And it is certainly also by promoting narratives of success, of which there are plenty for women, that we can assert that it doesn't have to remain like this, and that it is possible for women to have more positive experience, and that discrimination is there, but there are good reasons why the younger generation should not let that stop them, and that by not being stopped, we will diminish discrimination. I think this is also what history of science can teach us. And since Absolutely. Since I have mentioned, a quantitative study, I was wondering, Patricia, if there was, any possibility at some stage. You showed this wonderful photograph of all the women in your in the same year as you. Are there any studies of cohort of women graduate in science from given universities? And the question is, at what time does this become possible? Because, I mean, Bridget has mentioned maybe a few women of the same period as Mary Somerville, for whom we have traces, because, you know, the historian can only work when we have written sources. But at what stage do you think that numbers are sufficient so that we could begin to do prosopography or even, you know, quantitative studies?
Well, the picture I showed that was all of women was actually, because of England's strange educational system, was at a single-sex college. They weren't all scientists, they were covering the whole range of subjects. But certainly you can study those, and it's quite interesting looking at the sort of newsletters of universities and colleges to see how many colleagues that were at university with me did not pursue a career after they left university. But I think that's changing very rapidly, and I think the majority of women who leave Oxford and Cambridge now have very successful careers.
If I can butt in very quickly, I know Gemma Laurenat has a paper coming out very soon, which looks at, so it's like sort of a prosopographical study, but also looks at the women who studied at postgraduate degrees, especially in the USA between sort of 1890 and the First World War. And kind of, so they did a lot of statistical analysis at the time about whether these women were marrying, whether they were having children, because there was so much anxiety, both racist and sexist, about what these graduates were doing. So she sort of looked at that kind of, study of what happened to these graduates after they left. So a small plug for Gemma Laurenat's paper, it's coming.
So, but there's also an added problem in Britain. I mean, like with Hertha Ayrton, if you were married, until I think about 1930, if you were married, you could no longer practice as a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher or a civil servant. So that was an enormous disincentive, either to get married or to continue your career, depending what sort of person you were.
Yes, so in other words, the notion that you had to choose between so-called normal family life and a scientific career was not just, it was in the rules, not just in people's prejudice. So that's
absolutely was. And well, there's one case I found a woman who did get married, and she went on practicing privately. But even if you were doing that, she wasn't earning a salary. I mean, that was the problem with Hertha Ayrton. Another woman supported her financially. Otherwise, she could not have had a scientific career, and she couldn't have written all those papers at the Royal Society. So there's a lot of very practical problems that deterred women from working in that way as well.
Yeah, I think maybe we should put Bridget's question to Indianara about what, if you don't have systematic feedback, do you have any, at least some comments by students? How do students respond to your anti-oppressive education approach?
Thank you. Yeah, here, right now we are working on the theoretical approach, and then we're going to have master students and PhD students investigating this approach in their researchers. So right now we are just working on the theoretical approach, and then it's our aim also to investigate how this can happen in a context, in the classroom context. So it's the next step of our research here, but thank you.
I have another question for Bridget. What you showed us very interestingly today is that Mary Somerville, she used her husband as a mediator, but it means that she never even apparently tried to be physically present in spaces of knowledge that were, entirely male at the time. So do you have any evidence in your sources of whether she made this choice or whether she gave it a try and thought it was wiser to give up? Or, I mean, how did this work? Because one might feel this was self-censorship, or one might feel this was a very good strategy because she did have a place, but not that one.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting question. It's hard, especially when one of the best sources that we have on her life is her autobiography. And Dorothy Macmillan has a really nice book where she has so basically there are two manuscript versions of this autobiography in the Bodleian Library, and then the printed version, which was edited by Frances Power Cobb and Somerville's daughters. And so Dorothy Macmillan has a version of this where she's reintroduced a lot of the manuscript material that was edited out. So it's quite interesting to see kind of how the narrative, how Somerville was presented in the final product compared to maybe in the manuscript, and sort of what was taken out. But even then, it's still kind of hard. I did rush the end of my talk a little bit at the end. And one of the things I wanted to say is in her personal recollections, she does talk about, oh, when I was young, everybody called me the Rose of Jedburgh because I was pretty. And there was this comment in the letter that I included of there was not a hint of blue in her stocking, which means so blue stocking was kind of like a slur almost for a woman who was too intellectual or exclusively intellectual and had almost foregone her womanhood for intelligence. And so this letter is saying here's Mary Somerville, she's good at maths, but don't worry, she's still a woman. She's not abhorrent in any way. And so in her personal recollections, she talks about being beautiful, she talks about playing piano, she talks about painting, she talks about motherhood, and kind of how even when she was writing her books, she would always stop to help her daughters with their learning and take care of her daughters. And so it's hard really to know how much of that is because that is how she wanted to live her life. She wanted to look after her daughters, very valid, and how much of that is trying to present herself as still a successful wife, still a successful mother. She just also happened to write these scientific books. But I do think she must have consciously walked a line of I'm gonna there's only so many kind of feminine expectations that I can book. I still need to be, because as well, if she had started to be socially isolated because people didn't want to interact with her as a sort of society lady, she would have lost her access to these spaces. Then she wouldn't have been able to get into the building or the drawing room where she was meeting these people. So she was kind of in a bit of a bind. She maybe couldn't be too ambitious. But yeah, I do think the fact that she had a husband, not only the practical role he played, but just the fact that she had one was probably very useful in presenting that sort of still a woman kind of persona. Yeah, I don't know if she definitely went to the Royal Astronomical Society in 1844 as a guest of someone else, which is why Augustus de Morgan wrote that letter. He was you didn't need to wait for someone else. You could, you were a member. Although he doesn't say you could have gone on your own. He does just say, I heard you didn't know you were a member. You are, kind of thing. So I don't know with the physical space how much she tried. Oh, I will briefly finish. One final thing is that her son and her husband were both founding members of the Statistical Society of London. And there's a really fascinating letter from Charles Babbage, who's well known for his analytical engine. He's writing to Somerville, and in previous letters, they talk about maths together. She is clearly the mathematical one out of her and her husband. And there's this letter from Babbage being hi, how are you? Don't forget to send your husband to the founding meeting of the Statistical Society. But no hint that she should go. Like, it's just the husband. Like, so it is still this very male space where her son and her husband can go, but she can't. So yeah, it's very interesting. This kind of it's always an implicit blockade, I guess, from what I've seen.
Yeah, I think that the comment on her stockings not being blue also sends us to the long anthology that one could write about the incompatibility between being a woman and doing mathematics, and the possible damage to women in their bodies from studying, going into any kind of studies, in fact, not just scientific. So I think that's really the context. Basically, I think the comment says she's okay, she's doing maths, but she's, in good health and a proper woman. And it's obviously a huge compliment, I think.
Yeah, something really, I think it's taken out in the final version, but it's in the manuscript. Somerville actually had a daughter who died when she was 10, like when the daughter was 10, which is very sad. But Somerville writes about it saying sort of, I taught her too much mathematics. Her constitution couldn't take it. And it's just like heartbreaking to be like, no, misogyny told you that. Like, you didn't sort of hurt your child by teaching her maths. That wasn't it. I always wish I could go back and be like, no, don't think that. So yeah, it was even Somerville, who was she obviously didn't have any health issues from studying maths. Even she still believed that it was possible for that to happen.
Yeah, probably just a person of her own time. We have another question for Indianara. The question is, are you thinking about using cases of Brazilian or more generally Latin American women scientists in your project for teaching?
Thank you for this question. Yes, actually right now I have a PhD student who work on two Brazilian scientists, Neuza Mato and Elisa Frota Pessoa. And our idea is not only using Brazilian women scientists, but also use a different areas of inquiry, for example, chemistries, biologists, physicists. That's my area, actually. So in this case, we wanted to see how these oppressions can operate also in different contexts, in different places around the world. So we can learn about a Chinese woman doing science in Chinese or in the US, in the case of Wu that I was working on. So there are some peculiarities on these paths that we can learn from the history of them through a diverse, not all about the areas of inquiry, but all about the nationalities and context. So yes, we are going to use as much as women around the world as we can. So we hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have now answered all the questions that were put to you. So I would like to ask you whether we would like to say a few concluding words, each of you, or if not, I'd
like to say thank you for organizing the webinar. I found it really rewarding. So thank you very much for organizing it.
Well, I should like to thank the three of you for very interesting talks. And I think it's also a very good way to come together in a way that it was not necessarily what we expect from ordinary conferences. And so thank you very much to the three of you for your contributions and for also what you said in the discussion. And I'm sure the conversation on how the history of science can and should contribute to gender equality in science will continue between us and more colleagues in the future. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye to everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you to all the people who listened.
Yeah, thank you.